Evening to everyone, and welcome to the Ireland chapter of PMI series of live webinars. So we have a very lively panel discussion, I think, for you today. This is on the topic of lean program management and the facilitation layer. So today you can see, hopefully in front of me, we have Colin Burke, Customer Success Manager in EMEA, and we also have Allison Williams joining him in place of Ryan, in case anyone spotted that change last week in the lineup. And she is Program Management and Compliance Architecture Manager in the same area of the VMware Pivotal Labs. So we are going to talk today about lean program management. So first of all, hello, Colin, and hello, Allison. Thank you for joining us.
Thanks, Katrina. Nice to be here, and thank you for having us as well. Thank you for hosting the webinar. Looking forward to the discussion.
Yeah, thank you very much.
Thanks, Allison. So Colin and Allison are part of VMware Labs, and they're part of the leadership team, and they've been developing their practice with lean program management. So most of us chapter members are very familiar with the area of lean and agile, particularly in the area of software development, and we've had numerous topics come up in the past couple of years in the area of agile. So a lot of us, I think, as well, have started to talk about the difficulties that we're encountering. One size doesn't fit all. How does it apply to different technologies? How does it apply to different industries? So I think most of us have encountered some difficulties, and where Colin and Allison are looking at the difficulties is when we're trying to apply these lean practices and these methodologies on a scale and at a program level. So now we're straying well outside that nicely boxed off area. So Colin and Allison are going to discuss the core principles and practices that they see that underpin lean program management. So this evening, your participation is key, as always. So we're not going to have a clean Q&A session at the end. Colin and Allison would like you to engage them throughout in the chat, maybe give your comments, maybe give your pain points or things that you found have worked. And we'll try and keep that Q&A session lively as we go along and getting you to join in that conversation. So we'll round up as usual around 5 to the hour, and we'll make sure that everyone gets a note of their PDUs. And we've got some upcoming events as well that we want to let you know about, particularly the National Awards. So stay tuned. So Colin, I will, without further ado, hand over to you.
Great, appreciate it, Katrina. I'll share my screen as well to bring up the presentation. You guys can let me know once that's come up. But yeah, I mean, look, as I said, great to be here and kind of excited to bring this topic to a broader community. I know, myself and Allison are quite passionate about this subject area within our own organization and across the clients that we work with. But as Katrina said, we want this to try and be as interactive and as community orientated as we can. So please post your questions. We'll try and mediate as we go through and hopefully start to draw some lines and conclusions through those questions in, and also interested to hear what others' experiences have been as we walk through this, because it's absolutely an evolving practice, right? It's evolving for us. We've been doing it for a number of years, but there's still a lot to learn and a lot to develop in it. And I'm sure a lot of folks out here have a lot of experience that they can share as well and bring to the table, and absolutely would be interested in kind of continuing that dialogue tonight. So while we might not be able to hear you, we'll certainly be able to see the questions and work through those. So, Katrina did a couple of introductions there, so thank you, Katrina. And as she said, I'm the Global Customer Success Manager for Tanzu. I work mainly across our telco clients. So again, with a focus around the software development side of things, but mainly in the telco space. And I started my life at VMware within Labs as well. I was a technical program manager within the professional services group, and I came in as part of the emerging practice that was program management within Labs. And I think it might be useful to set the scene for folks because, and Allison will jump in here as well, the reason why this became important within Labs was, our Tanzu Labs, or formerly Pivotal, if anyone had heard of it, was essentially a consultancy practice built up on the idea of taking lean and agile and the core practices there to the rest of the software world. So trying to be the enablers of a new way of working within the software world, bringing products and services together to do that. And there was concepts that lived through there around a balanced team, being user-centric, being able to have the right people in the team to be able to work autonomously towards outcomes, and to be able to do that iteratively and ultimately focus on delivering outcomes. And that was the big push on it. But what we started to see was, as we moved from working with startups to working with larger organizations, there became a bigger need to be able to provide a level of governance and structure around that. And that's where this whole program management practice evolved from, and what we want to talk about today, and what our experience has been in trying to take those same principles that we did within labs from an enablement perspective and from a software delivery perspective, and apply them to the program management and that kind of governance structure that we needed to bring in as we worked with larger organizations. And with that, I'll hand over to Allison to introduce herself as well and add a little bit of context to that.
Sure, thanks, Colin. So similarly, I served as a technical program manager as well. My role evolved to that, I should say, from kind of a program lead or project manager for some of our smaller efforts. And what we were seeing was a gap in governance where as these smaller product teams were then supposed to work together in an enterprise, no one on our side was there to kind of correlate and work everyone towards a common mission impact. And so our clients were feeling a gap, and then also they weren't able to get the feedback they needed from the teams because the teams didn't understand the level of feedback they needed. So we came in kind of as program managers to help close that gap and ensure we could create that translation, between the stakeholders' need and the teams executing themselves.
Yeah, I think that's probably one of the most important aspects that we saw was, you always have, with lean and agile teams, you've got this autonomous layer that's working and delivering things in an agile manner. And then you've got executives who are measured in a completely different way and need confidence and need visibility and line of sight and everything into how those teams are working. But how do you deliver both without impacting one or the other? And that's where that whole idea of the facilitation layer became a really, really important part of what we were trying to develop. So with that, we'll kind of jump into a little bit of the content. I think it's probably important to start with, what do we mean by lean program management? Because I think it's probably not a well-defined term within the industry just yet, right? We've kind of merged two things together. There's different concepts behind what it means. And, even within VMware, there's been lots of debate around what's a technical program management mean? What's the technical aspect of it? So myself and Allison always try to start these conversations with a little bit of a definition, like what does it mean to us? And I think, when we think of a program, we think of it as that group of related initiatives that if we manage them in a coordinated manner, we'll be able to obtain benefits that wouldn't be available to us if we did them individually. So this whole concept of how do we bring multiple streams of work together, whether they're projects, initiatives, whatever we want to call them, how do we bring them together to deliver a greater outcome and deliver more value to our organization? And then we had this concept within labs that had started to grow quite, and I think anyone who's read the Lean Startup will have seen this term, right? Lean governance, this idea of bringing just enough structure to secure those great outcomes, that real value from multiple teams. So how do you start to, as you scale from one software delivery team or one product team up to multiples, how do you start to create the governance structure that will allow them to, again, still be autonomous, but deliver the value that they need to deliver as a slightly more scaled organization? And we'll talk about a few of the concepts in there. And I don't know, Allison, is there anything you want to add specifically around lean governance?
Not specifically lean governance, but I think defining what a program was to us isn't just important in this conversation, but we have it repeatedly with our own practitioners at the product level. They ask, why do we need a program manager? Isn't that just going to create tax and overhead for everyone? And we try to explain that the intent with the lean governance of a program is to ensure everyone's moving in the same direction and is prioritizing the same work, but not to take away the autonomy of the teams executing themselves.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think what we ended up doing was taking that definition of what a program meant to us and taking the lean governance practice that we had been really pushing across our scaled agile teams, pulling that together to kind of create this concept of, now we can create a practice that looks at managing this group of related activities to deliver those outcomes, but doing so through that constant facilitation and what we coined is discipline flexibility, right? Because I think you always, at the program level, and I'm sure everyone that's on this webinar will agree, anyone who's done, who's worked on large programs, you have to have discipline, otherwise things can go awry. Like you read lots of blogs where people talk about autonomous teams and owning their own outcomes, and I think that's great. And sometimes the reality of doing that is a lot more difficult than the theory might allow you to think. And so this concept of discipline flexibility is, how do we keep as much flexibility but bring in the discipline we need to be able to execute a program? And so that's what we really, when we defined what lean program management meant to us, that's what we ended up with as an organization. I was just going to say, Katrina, I see some people messaging about the audio. I think hopefully it's just a couple of people.
Yeah, I'm just advise that person to check their PC settings, because we seem to be okay with the broadcast. Yep. Thanks, Colin.
Anyways.
Actually, there was a question there, Colin, from Jackie, just to say, maybe if you want to say a little bit more about the lean startup, just to give people a bit more context on that. You mentioned it there at the outset.
Yeah, Lean Startup. So the Lean Startup is a book, right? So I don't know if anyone's read it. And there's also another kind of book in relation to that, which is Lean Enterprise. And it's this whole concept of, the Lean Startup was really around how do you take I think it's some of those core product practices that we see being adopted today. It's a really interesting book. It talks about how do you kind of focus on what your users need, how do you work through hypothesis and validation. Lean Enterprise takes that then to another level. But I think the important element of those books are that, for me, the big takeaway for me was, what are the riskiest assumptions? How do you validate those? And how do you take some of these kind of lean concepts and start to apply them at an enterprise level? And again, with anything that you probably read now, you take elements of it. But I think if anyone's interested in this space, there are two really interesting books to read through. So from here, I think, Allison touched on it a little bit, and I think this is where we'll probably get into a bit of a broader discussion. But why the change, right? So why change program management? Why not just continue to do it the way we've always done it, right? And I think we've touched on one of the fundamental reasons, which is, in the software world, at least in the technology world, our teams are changing how they're working. So how do we change the support mechanisms that we have for those teams and the delivery mechanisms to align with that? But even if you step back from that, I think, Allison, you can probably elaborate on this as well. It's not just related to software and technology teams, right? We've seen, and especially within Tanzu, while most of our conversations start around a technology conversation, they often grow into a much more organizational transformation conversation, because these elements are used as enablers for that. I think what we'll talk through now will be hopefully relevant to folks that don't work in the software industry, but work in organizations where you're delivering large programs in across kind of other verticals, essentially.
Yeah, I would say I come from a long background in aerospace, and we had to dovetail together hardware and software delivery. And a lot of the old mechanisms of program management for hardware are necessary due to the fact that you build it and it gets, launched into space. That's not coming back. We can't fix that. It's gone. So we can update software. Software updates more iteratively, and we can fix bugs after it's been deployed, etc. So the approach to developing and delivering software has to be more flexible than that of hardware. But for so long, we've just followed those same mechanisms for both. How do we now start to fold them together and leverage the good from the hardware delivery into the software, but also take those agile practices and figure out how to translate those into higher level programmatics? Yeah.
And I think you'll see then, as if you think about other industries, you'll see those kind of, I think, those correlations and how this stuff comes together in other areas as well. But there's four probably main things that I would call out in terms of why. One of them was outcome alignment. A lot of what we were seeing was there was this inability to cascade or map our goals through the organization. So while a lot of the time you can create a really solid strategy, how do you ensure that the individual practitioners, the teams that are working ultimately to deliver that, understand how their element ties into the greater outcome that the business is trying to achieve, right? How do you do that cascading intent down through the organization? And a lot of large programs or more traditional programs don't necessarily solve for that problem, right? And they don't really help teams understand the why behind why they're doing it. It's, this is what we're going to do. This is what your part of the puzzle is going to be. But one of the elements we wanted to adjust there was if you can create that mapping, if you can let people understand and join the dots from their day-to-day activities or the products they're delivering or the change element that they're driving and how that ties into the bigger outcome we're trying to achieve, you create, one, a lot more synergies, but two, you start to understand and create that faster feedback loop because people can start to see where those impacts are going to be. So we found that outcome alignment was one of the biggest challenges we were facing, and we wanted to solve for that. There was this idea of continuous measurement, right? This idea that, and a lot of people probably agree with this, right? That traditionally there's this wait till the end, or we've got a 2-year program. At the end of the 2 years, great, we completed the program. Okay, but was it successful? Well, no, we could have done this better. So why not again take this idea to come back and say, how do we measure on a more frequent basis, right? And we'll talk through some of the solutions that we brought in around this. But again, it came back to this, we need to solve for waiting till the end. We can't continue to do that. It's not working for us. We need to push forward. The other idea was this idea behind, we got stuck in a loop of building large multi-year plans, right? Building high fidelity out into the future, essentially through a crystal ball, right? None of us, I think if this year has taught us anything, it's that you don't know what's going to happen 2 months from now, never mind a year from now. So try and bring back to basics that idea of planning for where we have knowledge and where does our knowledge enable us to plan to, and then allowing that to then build on the plans going forward. So again, another fundamental part of what we do in software development in Agile teams, but taking that to the next level. And I see, I'm just going to pause here because I think Sharon has put something in the chat. I think it's a really good point, right? That the lean program management means to minimize waste and maximize results. I think that's a great way of summarizing it, right? It is absolutely, how do we make this as efficient as possible, take out all the bad bits, and be relentlessly focused on delivering value. And I think minimize waste, maximize results is a great way of framing it. And so this idea of outcome alignment, continuous measurement, large multi-year programs weren't really working for us. And then this part was probably the one that was causing the biggest friction, was command and control. So a lot of the time we saw people were centrally managing but not centrally enabling teams. So coming in with this is how we're going to do the program, this is how everyone's going to work, this is the way we're going to report, etc., etc. It doesn't always go well, right? You've got teams who want to be autonomous, you've got teams who want to own their own outcomes. They want to be enabled to be successful, but they don't necessarily want to be told how to do it. So how do you create a program structure that is more of a servant leadership type structure than a management type structure in terms of how you execute or deliver that? Now, I know that you'll often get leaders that will ask questions, well, that's great in theory, right? But how do I have confidence that teams are going to do the right thing, right? I'm used to being able to kind of provide more guidance than let them do it and hope that it happens. And we'll touch base a little bit later on in the slides on how we try to solve for that. But this kind of sums up the 4 main reasons why we felt like this needed to change. It needed an iteration in how we were doing things and what we were seeing with our clients as well. Allison, anything you would add, I guess, around this? You've got a lot.
Yeah, I think with Sharon's point there with the minimizing of waste, a lot of these 4 areas drove some of that waste, right? Like, let's build out this large multi-year plan that we're going to have to maintain and update and iterate on continuously. And it's going to take some meetings. We're going to need meetings. We're going to need people. We're going to, like, it's that micromanagement of all of those wasteful artifacts as opposed to generating cadences and business rhythms that can instead drive priority and help everybody move towards mission impact and mission value, and understanding what that business value is and how your little piece of the pie fits into the larger picture. So to your point, Sharon, I believe that we, in our approaches, have tried to maximize the results of the teams delivering on the ground through minimal waste in that lean governance.
Yeah. I think if you look at the principles of if you look at the Agile Manifesto and what that stands for, if you look at the principles of lean, I think you'll see a lot of that is a driving force behind a lot of this, right? And while it's not necessarily direct, you can see it's the underpinning principles of it.
And I think that's a very good point, that it is, and I sometimes have to remind people of this, there are principles in Agile.
Yes. Yeah.
They're not rules, they're principles, and they make sense. Even if you were working in waterfall, those principles make sense.
Yeah, there's a really good talk by Adam Fowler who talks about industrialized Agile, right? And it's this whole idea that Agile is a set of principles. You can have different practices in terms of how you apply those principles, but the fundamental principles will stay the same. Whereas a lot of organizations have ended up taking this approach of Agile is a rule book, right? It is a handbook that gets dropped down. That's ultimately defeats the purpose of it in a lot of ways, right? And actually, it's a really good talk. If anyone does want to go on, it's Adam Fowler, and it's the Industrialized Agile talk. It's on YouTube.
And Colin, actually, Jackie's making a good point here as well about sponsors have to support this approach. Yeah. We could put that on a T-shirt for project managers across the world. Like, in everything that we do, unfortunately, we still need the top down, don't we? We need the people at the top to go, we are giving this our 100% support and get it done.
Yeah. And
I think the key there, Katrina, is we have to be able to we have to give them the confidence to support it, to sponsor it. So, like, what are we providing to them that makes them feel comfortable in this approach? And that's that meeting them where they are piece.
Yeah. Yeah, and I think that's where the outcome alignment becomes really important, right? If you can show to them and be able to create, and we talk a little bit about it here, right? But, if you can show them the mapping and you can give them the confidence, you can create that facilitation, you still have to, and you start to show incremental value, you start to generate their buy-in. So I think you definitely will have a bit of skepticism at the beginning, but what we've seen is you very quickly start to create that buy-in. So when we talk about those 4 problems, right, what does lean program management bring to them, right? How have we tried to solve for this? So alignment frameworks, which literally just referenced, right, is how do we understand the value and what that value means for us and align behind that. So, one of the major elements of that is leveraging some of the frameworks that exist today, right? So one that we found particularly useful is the OGSM model, which is this idea behind like outcomes, goals, strategies, and metrics. I don't know if everyone's ever seen that, but the idea is you start at the top, right, and you understand, what are the ultimate outcomes that the organization is trying to achieve? What are the numerical representation of those? What are the strategies? What are we going to implement to deliver that? And what are the metrics? What are we going to use to measure that? And you break it down. It almost starts with one thing at the top, and then it goes layer by layer through the organization, all the way down from like the corporate level through to the product or portfolio or project level. And I think this is kind of going, like I see Mick has put in about sponsors, creates the alignment. And I think that's absolutely true, right? But in order for sponsors to create that alignment, they first need to be able to articulate the outcome, right? And this is where these frameworks become critically important, because if you can articulate the outcome you're trying to achieve, first of all, then you can start to tie elements to it. and then start driving that alignment. And you can actually communicate a strategy to your organization that people can get behind. That's the biggest point of it, right? Is you can drive alignment if you can show how the work that people do on a day-to-day basis is actually contributing to that bigger outcome that we're trying to achieve.
Yeah, I think with Amy's question with respect to how are you ensuring that tasks are getting completed and you're making progress without these traditional methodologies, I think some of the things you're going to get here in this wheel of management will help answer that. But one of the ways I try to describe it is, instead of generating a like an integrated master schedule, we build out outcomes-based roadmaps, and we almost treat them as like a pizza tracker. And it helps because it's not committing us necessarily to an exact time that your pizza is going to arrive, but you have like a comfort zone, right? If they've said your pizza is going to arrive in 31 to 42 minutes and it's 3 hours later, and it's still in the oven, something's wrong with the pizza tracker. You need more granularity there, or there's a blocker, it got stuck, or there's no drivers, or what happened to my pizza? Like, what's the threshold for when clients are going to start calling and asking? So building out that outcomes-based roadmap, it's not a schedule, but it provides that confidence layer of something's happening with my thing. I'm getting there. It's moving forward. I see the progress, kind of thing.
Yeah. And I think, like, as you said, Allison, maybe as we walk through this, we'll start to share a little bit more around that. I think you're absolutely right? So people do need to take a lead. They need to take ownership. And while I think this method doesn't necessarily, I hope it doesn't, it shouldn't push against it, but rather it should just enable it to be a little bit different, right? And that be a more shared responsibility, with the view of being able to see how your item impacts that. I see Sinead's question, which is actually a great question. And Sinead, I think this is going to be one thing where we might actually not touch on this today, but this whole idea of agile and iterative funding, I think, is one of the biggest challenges that go against everything in the agile world, right? I don't think it's been solved yet. And, I feel like we could talk about that for hours, but we have been constantly iterating on how do you solve for iterative funding, because it just doesn't jive with corporate finance as it exists today. And I think that's something we'll get to, right? So there's definitely parameters in that. I would love to pick up on that, maybe if we have a few minutes at the end to come back to that question.
It's a great question, and I've done, Colin, I've done a lot of work, and I know some of the people I can see on the chat have as well, as a consultant. So that's even more tied down, because they expect to get a quotation that they're going to sign off on at the beginning. They do not expect me to wander in the door in 6 months and go, great news, here's all we've accomplished, and now here's the bill. So so I think it hasn't been solved yet, but I think there's been micro changes that have improved it. So I think it's worth a session in itself, for sure.
Yeah, I mean, that would be a great, that might actually be a great panel discussion, because that would be, a lot of people have a lot of good input into that. I think, kind of going back to that point around, how do we kind of deliver this in a functional way, right? So the other element is taking that iterative planning mechanism that we do in small teams, but doing it at the program level. And again, that's what we've seen. It is really about managing the fidelity of our plans in line with our knowledge. Again, going back to the idea of, let's not plan 2 years ahead. We can plan out a year in low fidelity, and we probably do need to, because again, we all work with large organizations where you can't just kind of go back and say, well, I'll tell you what the next 3 months will look like, but I can't tell you what the next year is going to look like. We can tell you what the year will look like in low fidelity, but we're going to keep the short term the highest fidelity. And when we work through that and we validate and we learn, then we'll continuously iterate our plans to ultimately provide a finer view as we move forward. And I think, even going back to Allison's point about the outcome-based roadmap, that is exactly that as well. Sometimes you see the outcomes that are closer to us at this point in time have a lot more context to them. The ones that are further out in a lower priority are the ones that will be informed by what we do today. Can we enlarge the presentation? I don't know that I can actually make it any bigger than it is right now. So apologies for that.
It's full screen for sure. Anyway, I can confirm that. Yeah.
So And then the other piece of this wheel is the continuous measurement element of it, right? And I think what we've tried to bring in is, a lot of the time, you've got lag metrics, right, which are really the success metrics of what's going on, but they don't really help you adjust as you work through this, right? So if you're going to be more iterative in how you plan, and you're going to have a framework by which you join all of these dots, you also need to be able to understand how you influence that and how you adjust for that. So one thing we push quite heavily on is the idea of leading metrics. So what are the things that we can measure what are the things we can measure that we can actually influence? So if we see that measurement moving in a negative way, we can influence what we're doing there to push the metric in a way that helps us understand, are we moving successfully towards that goal or outcome that we've set ourselves to achieve? And that helps us with our iterative planning. So I think this whole measurement thing becomes critically important at this level, but breaking it down into leading versus lagging metrics. You need both, but you can't rely on one or the other. Allison, I guess on this note, right, because I know, with a lot of the public sector work, right, measurements become critically important there as well. I don't know if there's anything you want to add around this one, because continuous measurement has always become such a topic for us, and I think across the industry as well, right? How do you do that in a meaningful way?
Yeah, and unfortunately with Agile, a lot of people tend to focus on velocity as the metric or what have you. And unfortunately, it's not really a good measurement. It changes radically week over week. And anytime you have some kind of an ad hoc, high priority interrupt task that comes in that's not captured in a backlog, you look like you're losing momentum. So we try to help our clients to identify what the key metrics are that they really need to track to understand impact to delivering to their mission, and then show them what those measurements would look like and what the mechanism is for collecting those. One thing I do want to touch on is I think when we talk about lean program management, we want to make sure we're not saying we're not taking away from the traditional program management triangle. We're still managing the scope. So like, nobody should be adding toppings or features to the pizza. We're not going to increase costs by taking on more features. Or if we do, we're still managing that in a way where we say, you can go ahead and do that, but that will increase your cost. And that may incur against this timeline that we're talking about. And we also still need to manage risks and blockers that may be encountered. And we do a lot of that through our inception of the program and understanding with like a pre-post-mortem, what are all of the things that could pop up along the way, and how are we going to manage against those, and how could those impact our cost and our budget, and what are all of the dependencies. So lean program management is the way to still program manage, but in a lean fashion. So you're reducing the overhead and you're focusing everybody on the actual delivery of what's important.
Yeah, and I think there's a question there around, any examples of metrics you've used. So there's lots, right? I think it depends on the industry in a way in which is meaningful. I think if you look at the software development world, or when you're thinking about kind of modern platforms for modern applications, a lot of the time the simple goal is we want to reduce cost. That's that's more of a lag measure, right? You're gonna reach that goal. How do we know we're moving towards that, right? And I think some of the leading measures there will be time to provision an environment, right? How quickly can we provision something that helps us as a software team do our work? Because the quicker we do that, and that's something we can influence, we can chip away at, the quicker we can release a product to the market, and therefore we spend less time doing that activity. So we reduce the cost and we increase the revenue. So I think it's about kind of breaking that process down a little bit. So again, I'm happy to share more examples, but some of them will probably be more, I would say probably more software related. If that's interesting to the audience, happy to dive into it, but it may also be too specific, I suppose, as well.
I think, Allison, your example there, though, of how often are we pushing to production is a good, and how often, I would often say, how often are we pushing, as an end user, quality updates to production? Because sometimes you have to introduce underlying administrative changes that the user may not see the net effect of, but But my experience of velocity, and I saw that Jackie said it, like it like agreed it doesn't work. It actually put the software engineers in a very stressful environment where every sprint was about delivering something usable to the customer, when in reality a lot of the sprints are about clean up admin and keeping things running, and training, keeping things running well. So velocity is definitely not one of them, for sure, I think.
Yeah, I think that's I think another important point, Katrina, I think you were making there as well, is that sometimes correlating metrics is a critically important piece, right? So like, I think in that example, pushing to production is one metric, but I think it's one of those metrics you always want to measure against, whether it's NPS or quality or whatever those metrics are. So you can kind of say, well, yes, we're doing it quickly, but we're doing it with higher quality as well. And I think being able to get that right balance across these and being able to look at metrics and understand how they create a narrative for you was important as well. I see Jackie's question about organizational. I guess that's related to the metrics piece. I guess, Jackie, if you could elaborate on, do you refer to organizational change, organizational transformation, and then maybe we can call out a specific example that we've seen. I think the second last piece of this wheel is around facilitation, right? We've talked around that facilitation there a lot, but one of the key elements, I think, in going back to that idea around, creating stakeholder alignment and creating stakeholder buy-in and sponsorship, we believe that facilitation point is a really important aspect of this. And I would say that these things aren't necessarily in order, they're all part of the same thing. But one of the tools, and again, I'll go back to like this whole concept of the lean startup, right? But this idea of growth boards to drive continued alignment and confidence. So we've often found that it's one thing to set that cascading model of intent, and it's another thing to continuously measure against that and iteratively plan. But how do you then create the dialogue that's needed to be able to use all of that to make meaningful decisions? So a lot of us are probably quite familiar with the traditional steerco, right? Where, you go in, you give a progress update, talk about risks. Tends to be that there's a top-down view given, right? And we often refer to it as like the hippo mentality, right? The highest paid person in the room makes the decisions. The growth board concept is to try and take the same underlying principles of what those steercos are designed to do, but create a more collaborative environment for conversations to happen. So you still go in and you still talk about the progress that's happened, right? The achievements against the outcomes and how you've been measuring that. But you also use it as an opportunity to, and the board being your stakeholders, to provide back to the board your recommendation on what you do next based on the learnings that you've had, the validation you've been able to do, the measurements you've taken. And rather than letting them tell you the direction you want to go, you've seen the cascading intent and you make recommendations based on that, but based on real data and what you're seeing happening on a day-to-day basis. And you look for their sponsorship and buy-in through leveraging those learnings and that data and giving them the confidence that these decisions are not being made off the back of someone's gut. They're being made off the back of serious learnings that are going on in the program on a day-to-day basis. And then using that as a forum to ask for help and to drive against blockers and risks and those kind of things. So it becomes much more of a collaborative forum that we've found ultimately creates a lot more collaboration between leadership and the teams delivering on the ground. And Allison, you can probably speak to specifically to some of your experiences with growth boards as well, but this has been one of the bigger changes, I think, for us in terms of how we interact between those different levels of the organization.
Yeah, when we see successful growth boards occurring, you're focusing less on status and more on the moving forward strategy. What are we prioritizing? Where are we in our journey and what's next? So it's less of the rear view mirror look and more of the down the road look.
Yeah, and it's that whole, like, do we need to make a decision about whether we pivot, persevere, or kill, right, the initiative? And I think that's what you're trying to come out of this is, are we going to continue down this path? Are we going to change slight direction, or are we just going to stop what we're doing because we need to be brave and say this isn't creating the value we thought it would? And then the last point is this idea of disciplined flexibility, right? We've talked about it. It's this idea of bringing the best of both, bringing what we see work in our agile teams and bringing together what we've seen work from a program management perspective, and that triangle that Allison referred to, because you can't discount it, but it's about how do we adapt that then with what we've seen work in other areas to create this more flexible approach to how we deliver things. And maybe we pause there and just kind of quickly look at the questions as well, because I see there's a couple of more things coming in. So Jackie's question about organizational metrics, I think that's a challenging one. I've found it often depends on what the goals they're trying to achieve are, right? So I think one specific example I have more recently is, we were doing a bit of work with a company who were essentially trying to do a bit of both, right? So trying to modernize from a software perspective, but also modernize a way of working. And the biggest challenge there was ultimately they weren't able to retain, they could hire their workforce based on I think the brand, right? But they weren't necessarily able to retain them based on the way of working that was coming into that. So one of the easiest metrics there was just churn, right? The same, I say that from a customer success point of view, because that's what the whole industry was born out of, was churn from a customer perspective. But you look at churn from a staffing point of view or from a people perspective, and that's probably one of your biggest indicators of, is this an interesting place to work? Is this a fun place to work? And so depending on what your organizational transformation is trying to accomplish, I think those metrics will change. That's probably one that I've seen more recently.
I think it's funny. I come from public sector where we have a lot of military people continuously moving through different roles, right? They're in for 2 years, they're on to something else. So we have that kind of innate churn in the organizations that we're supporting. But really similar to what you were saying, Colin, we attempt to tie the organizational construct to the outcomes they're working towards achieving. And if there's that healthy delivery of those outcomes, and the environment itself is non-toxic, it feels like the right organization. We can very quickly see where people are just kind of hanging on because they have a role that's not really delivering anything. So reassessing the organization based on where we're headed is something we try to do on a regular basis as well.
Yeah.
There's another question here, Colin.
Okay. Yeah, actually, this is an interesting question. So I think we've talked a lot about it from a software point of view, where the teams might be agile, right? But I think this is probably a real strong personal opinion on this. So I will say this and then ask for a balanced view from Katrina and Allison. So I think sometimes the term agile is overthought about, and the way I think about it is like, the example I'm going to use here is people always fight back with even in our organization, and they say, well, we don't need a risk register because we're an agile team. We'll manage it in the backlog, right? And to me, that has nothing to do with agile, right? Agile is about, again, the underlying principles of what agile is, right? So people in interactions over something else, right? Working software over something else. It's not instead of, it's not versus, it's over. And I think if you think about that question from the team perspective, you don't need to be an agile team by label to still benefit from the principles that underpin what agile is. And that is thinking about things more iteratively, right? Thinking about things from a continuous learning and a rapid feedback perspective. You'll still benefit from that. I think what you have to remember is that you might still also have a critical path, right? You might still also have a start-finish relationship. But that's okay. But try and pull in some of those other principles that underpin lean and agile that will ultimately benefit you. Because I think if I go back up to the very beginning, that comment around minimize waste and maximize value, any team wants to do that, whether you're a product team, a project team, a support function with an organization, you take finance, HR, they're all adopting this because they want to achieve the same outcome of minimizing waste and maximizing value. So I think hopefully that answers your question, Sinead, but my opinion is that take the term agile almost away from there and just say how we do this just needs to be done in a more flexible manner. And then you go back to that risk example, it's let's just manage our risks on a daily basis. If we do that through a risk register, it doesn't mean we're not agile. We still are. It's about how we underpin, how we manage those risks, and that just making sure we visit them daily. We look at how they're moving. We make sure we're actively feeding back on those, right? It's all of those elements that personally I feel are important there.
Yeah, I plus up that one, Colin. I also think with respect to resisting the reporting of the continuous measurements, oftentimes quite the opposite is what I see, is that teams who are reporting continuously incur less, like, drop this and do that overhead, because people know where they are. There's more transparency.
I don't think you have a balanced panel here, Colin, because I'm afraid I also uptick what you said.
Okay.
But I would like to make a comment on what you just said there, Allison. Forgetting about Agile and forgetting about Waterfall, as a program manager and as a head of a PMO, when the reports stop coming, and that doesn't mean if it's even just a little update on Teams, a 5-minute chat at the end of the week, or if it's quick email, or if it's the proper official format that we have, or it's just an update on the Trello board. When they stop coming, I know that the project manager is in trouble and that they need help. It's as simple as that. And that's my sign. It's okay. And I don't even ask them for an update. I go to them, cup of coffee, and I go, how can I help? So reporting, like, to me, there's an overwhelming focus on it. And I loved your area before about command and control. And I just winced because I went, oh God, all the reports that we have to do, whether it's Agile or whether it's Waterfall, it doesn't matter. But it is all about being in control and supporting the team to get it delivered. So you just have to, unfortunately, we're not balanced here. We're all.
Yeah, well, that's what I mean. Maybe we are in some ways, right? Maybe we have the right for a train of thought, right? I think Brian's question around how does the organizational structure need to change to support this? I think it's a hard one, right? I think it all depends on the organization. One way we've looked at it is that, can you separate your delivery or engagement model from your reporting model? And what I mean by that is that how you do your work and how you work as a team and deliver on outcomes doesn't necessarily need to be tied to your reporting structure. And that might be easier in certain organizations, but I will speak specifically from a VMware or from a Tanzu and a Tanzu Labs point of view. Our engagement model has almost nothing to do with our reporting model to an extent, and we see no challenges from that. I think one is about how do you have the right support constructs from a professional development point of view, right? From a people management perspective, making sure that people have got goals, objectives, they're working towards that, they're developing, they have a mechanism of support from that reporting standpoint. The other is, how do you work as a team and how do you create those structures within that group to be, again, a self-supporting group and be able to work through that. And you might have servant leadership in that, you might have dotted line reporting, but I think the one thing we push for is, can you separate out your reporting structure from how you actually deliver your work, because they don't need to be tied together. And that's been something that we've seen work well, even in our own internal delivery models as well. We'll kick on through some of the slides. So again, this kind of comes back to this idea of, centrally enabled, not centrally managed, right? So again, some of this is probably broken record stuff, but it's this idea of how, I think, Katrina, you just touched on it, right? With the example you gave about, like, just going and talking to someone when you realize they're in trouble, not micromanaging that problem, right? And I think that's true if you scale this up, is how do you create the space for people to be successful and deliver value without trying to do that constantly for them. This is probably a bit of a summary slide. So what I'll say is, with all of that in context, and this is where I'll jump to Allison in a minute as well, because she'll speak to a lot of the value she's seen in the US from this. But by kind of focusing on the principles that we saw work and bringing this idea of the facilitation there to the front, we feel like we've been able to emulate a lot of the benefits we've seen with our teams, but at the program level, and we've been able to create that leadership alignment through that space. So, again, that idea of greater alignment, we've been able to reduce the gap of intent. We've been able to create empowered teams who feel like they can collaborate, right? Know they're doing the right thing because they know what they're doing together. So that that sentiment has definitely been there. We found that there's been fewer failed programs with our clients, with internally where we've done this, because we've been able to measure early and often. And when I say fewer failed programs, does that mean we haven't killed a few initiatives along the way? So we absolutely have, but we don't classify that as failed because we made a decision based on the data that we were seeing to stop doing something. We didn't let it run until we had realized at the very end, this wasn't working. We made a conscious decision early, or, at whatever stage we felt that this we no longer want to invest in this effort anymore. And that, I don't think, is classed as a failure. That is classed as a successful decision to not move forward with something, right? This idea of greater stakeholder confidence has come in because, and hopefully this addresses some of what we talked about around sponsorship support, but because we've facilitated the needs of those executives and we've understood how the teams needed to work, we've been able to kind of create that facilitation layer and that consciousness that both these groups need to be able to get what they need out of it. Because I always use this example that, like, a CEO is not judged on how agile his teams are. He's judged on probably the share price of his organization, right? So you need to remember that and give him what he needs, but also give the teams what they need to be successful. Because without one or the other can't be successful, but that they're both measured on entirely different things, right? And how do you kind of create that? How do you as a program team or as a program manager abstract away those challenges from each one, right? Which is a difficult challenge, right? But I think where we've seen a little bit of confidence grow. And then time to value. We've often seen that whether it's time to value from a product perspective or from a program perspective, we've been able to deliver more incremental value, which again, I think this is where you can loop back into this funding piece, because if you can show incremental value, you can fund on a more incremental basis, right? Because you can get that funding, you don't need to fund the entire program, you can fund an aspect of it. And as you show the value that's coming out of that, you can bring that back to your financial support mechanism, whatever that is within the organization, to continue to fund the program based on results. So I think these are some of the results we've seen, or the outcomes that we've been able to achieve. And Allison, I don't know if you want to add any context to any of these.
No, I think these are great. One of the things I think what we've seen in the public sector on my side is oftentimes programs weren't all focused on the same outcomes. And so that's why priorities got murky and it feels really ad hoc, playing whack-a-mole on whatever the most important thing is that pops up. So helping our clients to really focus on what are the outcomes that this particular program is driving toward. And then ensuring that all of the teams understand those priorities is that alignment we're looking for. You can't go and build separate products that are all at a different pace and still get to the same endpoint at the same time.
Yeah, and I realize we're coming up on time, and I promised Katrina we'd finish at 5:02. So I'll go on to the next slide, and this is the principles piece, right? So our practice, we developed a set of principles that we wanted to live by. We wanted to share them, and then a little kind of quote that it wouldn't be me if I didn't have a quote at the end of a presentation, so I'm going to keep it in there anyway. But the idea of partnering at every level, right? Again, going back to this, don't just partner at the team level, don't just partner at the executive level, partner at every level of the organization, whether that's your client or whether that's internally, to make sure you fully understand what everyone needs. Understanding your organization or your client's organization, but making sure you're meeting them where they're at. Allison touched on this, right? Making sure you're understanding what the outcomes they're trying to achieve are and customizing your approach for that, right? Again, thinking about this as a set of principles, not a set of practices, right? Apply those principles as you see fit to be able to generate the outcome that you need to achieve. And again, bring that discipline, flexibility, that level of lean governance. So you don't undermine what's so important about program management, but you just create a more flexible environment for it. And this disciplined flexibility, right? Bring what we know is good and be flexible about it, as we just said. And then deliver business value. So can we stay relentlessly focused on the value and the outcome we're trying to achieve? Can we be heads up all of the time saying, are we doing the right thing for the outcome we're trying to achieve, and trying to eliminate waste on a continuous basis by doing that? And I think if you can pull yourself out of the weeds and pull your teams out of the weeds on a continuous basis to say, let's get out of delivery mode for a second. We set out to achieve outcome X. Is what we're doing here helping us get there? Is that what our leading metrics are telling us? And if they are, great. And if they're not, question, right? Should you still be doing it? Do you need to make a decision? And then the quote, it's not by anyone famous, but it's one that we try to live by in labs, and it's that a program is greater than the sum of its parts, right? So if you treat these things as individual pieces, they won't be successful. But if you can bring them together, it'll be a much more meaningful outcome for the organization. So I guess with that, I'll hand it over to Allison and Katrina, but I appreciate the time and hopefully everyone enjoyed the discussion.
Well, thank you very much, Colin. I'll do my usual wrap up, which I know all the members are well used to. I'll share my screen when you're finished sharing there, and I'll give people a few updates. I think, as you all have probably seen there, that was a lot of interaction from the audience, and it's a typical thing I find when we are talking about Agile. It just seems to be how it is. Agile gets us all energized. Hopefully sometimes for the right reasons, and unfortunately sometimes for the wrong reasons, because it sounds like a few of us had some maybe not so positive experiences. So I think we took a few good takeaways there. We talked about some follow-up panel discussions, maybe focusing in on the financial management that comes with trying to move to a lean practice, trying to move away from waterfall. So it's definitely something that we'll follow up on. And for you as the audience to remember as well, Colin got in touch with me, told me that he had an idea for a presentation and would be interested in presenting. And that's how Colin and Allison are here this evening. So you can do exactly the same thing. So if it's an area that you're very passionate about, that you've got experience in, good, bad or ugly, then definitely get in touch, because this is a membership forum. So it is for us to share and collaborate together. And I think that this evening's webinar, Colin and Allison, that it's just been an absolutely fantastic example of a really good collaboration and a conversation with the audience. So thank you very much for that. I think that's been very, very good. And we have, guys, as you'll all know as members, I'll take care of your PDU for you. This time it is a half a strategic and half a technical PDU, and that will come through in the next couple of days to a week for you. We'll also hopefully have a recording to share with you. So just check into the events archive page in the next week, and you should have all of that information up there for you to share. So now, while we're coming to the end, I do want to let you know about one thing. If you haven't heard or seen about the National Project Awards, you need to get onto the website straight away and have a look. There's only a couple of more days left to the deadline on the 17th of May. And I think given the year that we've all had in the industry, project and program managers and the project profession in general, we've worked our socks off. So this is really a time for you to think about the team that you've been working with, think about the projects that you delivered, and think about the people, maybe even the individuals, and have a look at the awards and ask yourself, is there someone that I could give some recognition to? Is there some way that I could, say thank you to those people? And to me, the National Awards is the perfect way to do that. So you've got a couple of days left, and it's not too late now. So get that nomination in, and just say thank you to the team in that way. I think it's a very important way to do it. So I have a screen in my way here, guys. Apologies, I'm learning a new technology. And Jackie Glynn has reminded me in the chat, so that you all have the reminder as well. Thank you very much, Jackie. You will get 2 PDUs if you put a nomination in. So there's something in it for you as well. But I cannot stress that recognition and reward for others for the year that we've had is very, very important. So again, thanks, Colin and Allison. Thank you very much for joining us this evening. Thanks for the idea for the topic, and thanks for running the discussion.
Yeah, thank you very much, Katrina, for having us.
And thanks very much to the audience as well, because as we've just said there, when there's a conversation going, it makes it less of a watching television experience and more of an interactive chat. And we will be following up on some of those topics to take away for future webinars. So that just leaves me to say thank you very much to everybody, and we look forward to seeing you for the next webinar, which I think is actually next week. So we shall see you then. Thank you.